A grieving father, heartbroken after burying his mentally ill son, faces an unimaginable surprise. Just days after the funeral, he receives a shocking phone call from the cemetery that turns his world upside down. What follows is a series of unexpected events that will leave you stunned. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the peaceful morning in Wildemar, California. Frank Kerrigan, Sr., 82, shuffled across the room to answer it. As he lifted the receiver, he had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. "Mr. Frank Kerrigan?" A stern voice crackled through the line. "This is the Orange County Coroner's Office. I'm sorry to inform you, but we've found a body. We believe it's your son, Frank Jr." In that instant, Frank's heart shattered into a million pieces. Was his son, his boy, gone forever? The voice on the phone was certain. They claimed to have used fingerprints for identification. Frank didn't even think to question it. Why would he? These were professionals after all. The man sank into his worn armchair, clutching a faded photograph of a younger man with a big, goofy smile. Frank Jr. in happier times. A tear rolled down his cheek as he stared at the picture, his mind reeling from the devastating news. No father should ever outlive his son. But Frank Jr. wasn't just any son. At 57 years old, he had been battling mental illness for years. According to the doctors who treated him when he first started showing symptoms of being unwell, he was suffering from paranoid delusions and schizophrenia. It broke his father's heart to see his own flesh and blood battle his own mind day after day. Things got even harder when Frank's wife passed away 10 years ago. She had always been there for their son, helping him through the tough times. After she died, Frank Jr. seemed lost, like a ship without an anchor. Things got so bad that he ended up living on the streets. Frank Sr. had two other kids too, John and Carol. They were always worried about their brother. John would drive around town looking for Frank Jr., hoping to convince him to come home. Carol would leave food and warm clothes in places she knew her brother might visit. It was like a never-ending game of hide and seek, but with really high stakes. The family tried their best to help, offering support and suggesting treatment, but Frank Jr. was stubborn. He refused to take his medication or accept help. It was like watching someone you love slowly drift away, just out of reach. His father and siblings were worried sick, but they couldn't force him to come home. They'd see him sometimes, looking scruffy and thin, but still with that familiar spark in his eyes. Every time they saw him, they'd offer help, but Frank Jr. would just smile and say he was fine. As the Kerrigan family prepared to say their final goodbyes, they wanted to give Frank Jr. a proper send-off. They planned a big funeral that cost a whopping $20,000. They picked out a nice casket and chose a spot in the cemetery not far from where Frank's wife was buried. On the day of the funeral, about 50 people showed up. Some had come from as far as Las Vegas and Washington State. John, Frank Jr.'s brother, gave a heartfelt eulogy. There wasn't a dry eye in the cemetery as he talked about his brother's kind heart and struggles with mental illness. Frank Sr. stood by the freshly dug grave, looking at the body inside the coffin and trying desperately to push away the feeling that something felt off. The person in the coffin didn't look exactly like his son. Life on the streets had changed his features, but as his father, he would have recognized him among thousands of lookalikes. But there was no reason for him to doubt the coroners. Maybe that's just what happens when someone dies, Frank thought. The old man felt like a piece of his heart was being buried. He kept thinking about all the things he wished he'd done differently. Maybe if he'd tried harder, Frank Jr. wouldn't have ended up on the streets. The guilt was eating him up inside. As the pallbearers lowered the coffin into the ground and each member of the family tossed a handful of earth in the pit, his heart broke in 1,000 pieces at the thought that he had survived two loved ones. Frank and his family were lost in a fog of sadness for days after the burial. They cried a lot and looked at old pictures of Frank Jr. The grieving dad kept seeing those unfamiliar features in his mind. The man in the coffin didn't have the same eyes, or the same chin, or the same ears, and yet that unknown man was his son, or wasn't he? The question would be answered on the 11th day, when something incredible happened. Frank was sitting in his favorite chair, holding the picture of Frank Jr., when his phone rang. His heart raced. Phone calls had become a source of dread since that awful day. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Mr. Kerrigan? This is Robert Hansen from Memorial Park," came an unfamiliar voice, sounding hesitant and uncomfortable. Frank's brow furrowed. Why was the cemetery calling? Had something happened to his son's grave? The thought of someone desecrating Frank's final resting place made his stomach churn. He swallowed hard as he replied, "Yes, this is Frank Kerrigan. Is something wrong?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a deep breath. "Mr. Kerrigan, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but we've had a situation arise regarding your son's burial. Frank's heart began to race. What kind of situation? He asked, gripping the phone tighter. The man's voice shook as he spoke. Sir, this is unprecedented, but we have reason to believe there's been a mistake in identification. We've received information that suggests the man we buried may not be your son. Everywhere seemed to spin around Frank. What? That's impossible. We had a funeral. I saw him in the casket. I understand, sir. And I can't imagine how distressing this must be, Robert said, his voice filled with genuine concern. But we've been contacted by the coroner's office. They've informed us that new evidence has come to light that casts doubt on the initial identification. Frank struggled to process this information. Are you telling me my son might be alive and I buried a complete stranger? Mr. Kerrigan, I don't have all the details, but yes, that's the possibility we're facing. The coroner's office is reinvestigating, and they've requested we do not take any action with the burial site until they complete their inquiry. Frank's mind raced with questions and a desperate spark of hope. I don't understand. How could this happen? What do we do now? Sir, I know this is a lot to take in, Robert said gently. The coroner's office will be contacting you directly with more information. They're treating this as a top priority. In the meantime, if you need any support or have any questions about the cemetery's role in this, please don't hesitate to call us. As the conversation ended, Frank sat in stunned silence, the photo of Frank Jr. still clutched in his trembling hands. Could it be true? Could his son somehow still be alive? Had he been right all along, thinking that the man in the coffin was not his boy? A mix of emotions, hope, confusion, anger, and disbelief washed over him as he realized this shocking turn of events. Now, Frank Sr. faced an unimaginable mystery. If Frank Jr. was alive, who did they bury? Where was his son? And how did this shocking mistake happen? He needed answers. With shaking hands, Frank Sr. dialed his daughter Carol's number. The phone rang several times before she picked up. Dad? Carol's voice was thick with lingering grief. Is everything okay? Frank took a deep breath. Carol, honey, you need to sit down for this. I just got a call from the cemetery saying that we might have buried the wrong person. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dad, Carol said slowly, that's not possible. We were all there. We saw Frank being buried. Are you feeling all right? I know how it sounds, sweetie, Frank Sr. replied, his voice cracking with emotion. I think someone has made a terrible mistake. Carol gasped, and he could hear her starting to cry. Oh my God, she whispered. What do we do now? Frank straightened his shoulders, feeling a surge of determination. We need to get to the bottom of this. Can you come over? We need to figure out our next steps. Carol's initial disbelief quickly turned to determination. Within an hour, she was at her father's side, ready to unravel this incredible twist of fate. Together, they began a relentless quest for the truth. Their first step was contacting the Orange County Coroner's Office. The Kerrigans presented their case, and the gravity of the potential error began to sink in. An immediate investigation was launched. Over the following days, the Kerrigan family worked tirelessly. They provided new fingerprints, which the coroner's office compared against those of the deceased. As they dug deeper, a disturbing truth emerged. Doug Easton, the attorney they hired, uncovered a series of critical errors in the identification process. The coroner's office had failed to match the corpse's fingerprints through law enforcement databases. Instead of pursuing further verification, they had resorted to using an old driver's license photo of Frank Jr. for identification. The family was stunned. How could such a crucial process be handled so carelessly? In a tense meeting with coroner's officials, Carol's voice shook with anger and disbelief. How could you not double-check? She demanded, her eyes blazing. Do you realize what you've put our family through? The officials looked ashamed as they explained their error. When they finally re-examined the fingerprints at the family's insistence, they discovered the horrifying truth. The prints matched someone else entirely. As the Kerrigans grappled with this revelation, they found themselves facing a new mission. They were determined not only to reunite with Frank Jr., but also to identify the man they had mistakenly buried and ensure such a grave error would never happen again. The family's ordeal caught the attention of the media, and soon the story spread like wildfire. The Orange County Sheriff's Department, speaking through Lieutenant Lane Lagarette, extended their regrets and promised a thorough review of all identification policies. For the Kerrigans, the joy of discovering Frank Jr. was still alive was bittersweet, tempered by the shock of the system's failure and the lingering questions about the unknown man they had mourned. As they worked to right this wrong, they also focused on finding Frank Jr. The the family sprang into action. They reported the case to the local police department and urged them to launch a search for Frank Jr. as a missing person. The police, now aware of the gravity of the situation, mobilized their resources. They distributed Frank Jr.'s photo to Orange County patrol officers and homeless outreach teams. Given his history of mental illness and homelessness, they focused their efforts on areas known to be frequented by the homeless community. Days passed with no sign of Frank Jr., each hour intensifying the family's anxiety. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected source on a warm afternoon. A volunteer in Santa Ana recognized Frank Jr. from the missing person flyers. She immediately contacted the police, who rushed to the location. When the officers arrived, they found Frank Jr. sitting on a bench outside, looking disheveled but very much alive. They quickly called the father. "Mr. Frank Kerrigan, we've found your son. He's alive and well in Santa Ana." Frank Sr.'s hands shook as he called Carol and John. Within minutes, they were racing to the location, hearts pounding with anticipation. As they approached, they saw Frank Jr. sitting on a bench. The old man rushed forward, tears streaming down his face, enveloping his son tightly. Carol and John arrived moments later, joining the emotional reunion. "What's going on? Why is everyone crying?" Frank Jr. asked. Unaware of the commotion surrounding his supposed death, he was confused by the fuss but relieved to see his family. As joy swept through the Kerrigan family, they didn't forget about the unidentified man they had mistakenly buried. They were determined to right this wrong and bring closure to another family. The police, working closely with the coroner's office, re-examined the fingerprints of the deceased man. This time, they thoroughly checked various databases, including those for missing persons and unidentified remains. Their persistence paid off when they got a match in a missing persons database. The fingerprints belonged to a man who had been reported missing by his sister 3 months earlier. This man, like Frank Jr., had struggled with mental illness and homelessness. With this new information, the police were able to contact his sister. The news was bittersweet for her. The confirmation of her brother's death was heartbreaking, but it also brought a sense of closure after months of uncertainty. The Kerrigan family, deeply moved by the situation, reached out to the sister. They offered their condolences and support, feeling a unique connection to her experience. Together, the two families worked with the cemetery to arrange for the man's proper burial and a memorial service that honored his life. For the Kerrigan family, the ordeal was a roller coaster of emotions, from devastating grief to incredulous joy, and finally to a deep sense of responsibility. However, this mistake caused a lot of problems. The government stopped sending Frank Jr. the money he needed because they thought he was dead, and reopening his case took a huge toll on the family. The officers refused to believe them at first, mocking their story, and only the intervention of the police convinced them that they were not lying to scam them out of money. Frank Jr. was truly alive. Moreover, the family had spent a ton of money on a funeral for someone they didn't even know. The real dead man's relatives would have never spent $20,000 on the ceremony. And despite being willing to cover the cost of the casket and the funeral arrangements, they weren't financially prepared to pay for the flowers, the beautiful sermon, and the refreshments. Frank Sr. and his children didn't want to burden them with a hefty check while they were already dealing with the unexpected death of their loved one and offered to finance some of the funeral costs. Thankfully, the community came through with generous donations that helped ease the burden. But the money wasn't even remotely the worst pain of all. They had gone through the awful sadness of thinking Frank Jr. was gone forever. And even though they were happy he was alive, the whole thing had been really hard on the family. Frank's daughter Carol said, "We thought he was dead. We buried him. Those feelings don't just go away. It's like when you have a really scary nightmare. Even when you wake up and know it wasn't real, you still feel scared for a while." Frank Jr. didn't seem to understand how upset his family had been and decided to go back to living on the streets. His family was sad about that, but at least they knew he was okay. For Frank Sr., the end of this ordeal was a mix of happy and sad feelings. He was so glad his son was alive, but the whole thing was really hard on him. He found himself checking things over and over, always worried about making a mistake. But there was also something good that came out of all this. The family started spending more time together. They realized how important it is to be close to the people you love. They tried harder to stay in touch with Frank Jr., even if he didn't always want their help. As time went by, Frank and his family started to feel better. They still had problems. Frank Jr.'s brain issues didn't just go away, but they faced them together. They started telling people about what happened to them. They wanted to help ensure other families didn't have to go through the same thing. Frank often went back to the grave where he thought he'd buried his son. But now, instead of feeling sad, he felt thankful. His son was out there somewhere, alive and breathing. And among all the craziness, that was something to be happy about. So what do you think about this shocking story? How would you feel if someone you thought was gone forever suddenly came back? Tell us about it in the comments. And don't forget to come back for another amazing true story that'll blow your mind.